So thanks for agreeing to do this interview with me. And as I said to you, I want it to be more of a conversation than a set of questions and answers. But obviously, there are some things I like to cover. And
Sure.
so maybe you could just begin by talking about how you got involved with Russia. What your motivations were and the beginnings.
Happy to do so. Well, I can't start at the right spot. I'll go back further just to say that I'm was born in Yugoslavia. I'm a Macedonian ethnically, and as a child we spoke Macedonian at home. But at age 15, my father wanted us. I was 4 when we came, so I didn't remember much. He
And you
took
came
us
to Canada
to
then,
Canada,
correct?
yeah,
Yeah,
only to Canada.
where in Canada?
Well, we started off in Hamilton, Ontario, but when I have lived in Canada since I became an adult, it's been in the Toronto area
Okay.
and
Okay.
a little bit in Ottawa. In any event, that's relevant. Why? Because when I was 15 and I went back, I fell in love again with our Eastern Orthodox culture and the language, and I taught myself to read and write Macedonian. And I was only 15, but that sparked an interest in the
Wow.
broader Eastern European.
Yeah. So wait a minute. You went
Right.
back by yourself at 15?
No, I was there with my parents, of course, and then 2 years later, I went back for another 3 months of debauchery after finishing high school. So
Yeah.
that all reinforced my passion for the Slavic people, and I identified with them. And when I eventually did go to Moscow, I identified very strongly on a cultural level with the Russians. Now, how did I get there? Well, I did 2 degrees, undergrad and a master's degree. I didn't do any Russian language studies, but I studied a lot of Russian history, politics, and economics. It was probably almost a little more than the third of all the courses that I did over 6 years. So I was
And what institutions?
I did my undergraduate at the University of Toronto,
Uh-huh.
and then I got a scholarship, a modest one, to go to Carleton University, where there is a Canada's first, no longer only, but Canada's first School of International Affairs, graduate and postgraduate. And I did a master's degree there. And I met some wonderful academics who were very well versed and published widely on Russia and the Soviet Union and both history and economics. And so I was very proud of that. But as like luck would
I'm
have
sorry,
it,
let me interrupt you. What years was these?
yeah, I started graduate school in 1978, and by 1980, I was looking for something to do, and I wrote the Foreign Service exam in Canada,
Ah, okay.
not expecting anything. And surprisingly, or I was the most surprised person, I was chosen. But I wanted to be a political officer, but they said, no, we think you're better suited to be a trade officer. So that was not but I said, okay, I'm game for anything. And so I spent the first year or a few months in Ottawa. Then I went they sent me to a regional office in Regina, Saskatchewan. Now that's relevant because the steppe in Russia and dryland farming and agriculture. And although my father was an agronomist back in Yugoslavia, I despised anything agricultural. But I learned quite a bit while I was there, and that served me well when I eventually went to Moscow. Now, I only got to Moscow because I challenged my personnel officer who wanted to send me to Chicago. And I said, I don't want to offend you, but you haven't read my CV. I speak multiple Slavic languages, and I have a strong interest in the region. And I know there's a position coming up in Moscow. So what do you say? He said, well, I don't know. I'll have to think about it. Well, eventually I got assigned, and prior to going, they put us on Russian language training.
Okay. And
And
what year? In
that
what
was
year?
in 1981.
81.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So I boasted to that same personnel officer that I shouldn't go to Chicago because I could learn Russian really fast. It was a full year program, and true to my word, I finished it in 3 months.
Uh-huh.
and I was fluent. And then I just had a casual conversation structure with a very attractive, somewhat older than me, young lady from Kiev who was a Russophile, and so that helped me be fluent.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so I ended up in Moscow, arriving in August of 1982 as the third secretary in the commercial division. There was three of us in the commercial division. And what I learned in Saskatchewan, and also what I could smell, there were opportunities for Canadian business. And
Huh.
my role was to work with Canadian companies, primarily for exporting technology and livestock. And I was on the happy end of a 1 million bull semen contract that we signed with the Russians, the Soviet agency at the time, and some live animals. And I did pitch the Canola Council of Canada. You probably know what canola is. It's
Sure.
an oil seed, and I had a phenomenal idea, and I was really passionate about it. And they dropped me like a sack of potatoes because they said, "Well, we don't want to teach those commies how to grow canola because then we won't have a market." I said, "You don't have a market today. How do you expect to get a market?" Anyway, I left that meeting, but through those first 2 years, my cultural affinity was really cemented. I made far more contacts than my colleagues in the political section of the embassy, and I learned quite a bit. And I was very proud that the first ambassador I had there, because they switched in my mid posting, was the son of former Prime Minister of Canada, Lester Pearson. And
Oh,
he only came to me, which drove my boss crazy. He was the commercial counselor, but he came to me because he could see that I was really in the country and not just pretending. So that was a great experience. Now,
yeah. So that's a big difference that you were in the country and not sort of visiting. But that provokes some I don't know, envy, not jealousy, suspicion, whatever. Yeah.
I think all of the above,
Yeah.
because I was the best Russian speaker amongst the Canadians, and I had a lot of friends. I had to be careful because the then KGB were scrutinizing us very closely. I had to smuggle some friends from Kiev into our apartment and things like that. And I had to be careful also that they were looking, the FSB, KGB were looking for targets. And I wasn't directly targeted, but I knew I was, and I behaved myself, kept my nose clean. But I
Right.
had a wonderful experience in those 2 years. So it made me really keen to continue. And um, and at that point, there was no option to extend for a third year. They said you have to go on another posting now, and I said, well, I'd like to go to a Hispanic speaking market. I'd like to go to Mexico, or I'd like to go to Brazil. And they said, oh no, you're going to Atlanta, Georgia. So all the experience I had built up, they,
They were determined to send you to the U.S. somehow, huh?
yeah,
Yeah.
they were.
Yeah.
And to say that I was not thrilled to be in Atlanta, I mean, we had a nice time socially, but business was so easy that I got frustrated with Canadians writing to me saying, could you give me a list of car parts distributors in South Florida? And I would photocopy and mail to them the relevant phone book from. And I said, "This is not fun. It's not hard to do."
Right.
So
Right.
I got out of there after 2 years, and I did so by agreeing to go to the Middle East. And so
Uh-huh.
they were going to send me to Abu Dhabi, and in the end, they had to send me to Baghdad. Um, because my predecessor there was a raging alcoholic and they had to fill the spot quickly. So I spent 2 years there, had a lot of fun. I maintained my connections to Russia. I met everybody in the Soviet embassy and we had them for dinner. And that provoked in the security officer of the embassy to complain to the ambassador.
Mm.
I was the number two in the embassy, but he called me in and he said, "Listen, you're far too close to these Ruskies. You know,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
they're targeting you." And I said, "Well, I think I can hold my own." And this was the same person was in his first and last ambassadorial appointment. He never left his office, and when he did, he'd go because he was born in Denmark. He would go to the lunches of the Scandinavian ambassadors, and of course that was a circular discussion. So anyway, I survived Baghdad, and I came back. I came back to Ottawa and spent 2 years, and I was deputy director in the division responsible for economic affairs with the whole region, not just Russia, but Central and Eastern Europe.
And what year was this when, where are we now?
That was in 84 to
Oh,
80, 86.
okay. Just
Okay.
just before Perestroika, right?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
well, as it was starting, to be honest, because while I was in Baghdad, I heard about perestroika and glasnost, and I got to experience it firsthand because I was inundated after I returned to Ottawa, inundated by business requests for linkages, contacts, information, and I was overwhelmed, frankly, because I was the only person in the division who had actually been and worked there. So but
Uh-huh.
that opened my eyes that there was interest and that it could lead to something else. So after 2 years there, I had an offer to become the executive director of the Canada USSR Business Council. I moved back to Toronto from Ottawa and spent 2 years, and it was absolutely fascinating. Um, I was, in fact, for about a year. Well, actually, before I left Moscow, I became the agent for Lada Cars of Canada, and we managed to buy all sorts of Ladas at the dirt cheap price of $3,200. And I was chastised by my bosses, but in any event, I I took that on afterwards, and so once I got noticed by the private sector while I was in that job, still in Ottawa,
I see.
because these are people who were asking me for advice and contacts, etc. And so, much to my surprise, that group was very keen to start a business council, and they pegged me to be the general director of this business council. At one point, we had 260 firms. We had 25 of the largest Canadian companies join, and
Wow.
and my offices were in one of the towers in Toronto, and the chairman of the association, very prominent Canadian business leader, he was four floors above. So if I needed to bounce things off, I'd go up and see him. So that was a fascinating experience as well.
Yeah. What kinds of products or sectors were the Canadian companies interested in the Soviet Union as it was opening up?
Right. Primarily oil and gas,
Uh-huh.
because Canada, for its sins, was very progressive in tertiary uh, extraction of oil
Mhm.
and heavy oils, etc., and injection of steam to make the oil rise. So, I mean, agriculture was almost equal in terms of the interest, but the agricultural side was principally for sales. But when I was there the first time, I was, well, we're in Toronto now, but I've neglected to say that when I was there in 82 to 84 on the ground, I worked with some of these vendors, bull semen, embryos, agricultural equipment. In fact, the first and only license to reproduce a Packer Harrow drawbar, which is a dryland farming till,
Uh-huh.
was made on my watch, and the Russians paid $6 million for the license. They never produced a single one of these things, but they saved basically this small Saskatchewan company that had the patent on this type of equipment. In any event, so agriculture, oil and gas, And that was basically it.
Uh-huh. Okay.
However, in the business council, we had basically everybody in every sector imaginable, and there was very high degree of interest because our prime minister at the time, Brian Mulroney, had been invited to go to Moscow, and he um, convinced about 180 other Canadian business people, wives included, to travel there. And I organized that visit and trip. And so the enthusiasm was really, really high.
Yeah.
But as high as it grew, it fell even further when some of these people who were not really patient enough to understand what you could do and how to do things in the Soviet Union, they lost interest in about 18 to 24 months. And so
Okay.
I couldn't even get a quorum for a board meeting to talk about our initiatives. Um, but we had a lot of initiatives, and I got funding from the government to bring Russians to Canada to go to business school, and we did a lot of things that were, I guess, pioneering in that at that time. Of course, the Security and Intelligence Service was was suspicious because they thought these people were going to be spies. Well, I imagine some of them were, but in
Yeah.
any
Yeah.
event, we influenced several hundred Russians, and many of whom became bank presidents and senior bureaucrats because they got to go to York University in Toronto for a 3 month mini MBA, as we called it. So things
Uh-huh.
like that were for me very satisfying that we catalyzed that project, and I shepherded most of the Russians who went there. So
Right. And this was still in perestroika and Soviet times.
oh, absolutely. This was
Yeah.
1990 to 92. I got to meet Gorbachev when he came to Canada for a state visit, and a lot of his senior people, because I was the only functionally uh, literate Russian speaker. I mean, it's a sad condemnation of our foreign service, but I was, and so that gave me some, I guess, some notoriety, and which helped. And so after uh, what I told you about Atlanta. So
Yeah.
from Moscow, or from the Business Council, that lasted 2 years. In 1992, um, I I left. I left the Foreign Service for good.
Uh-huh.
I was headhunted. Well, not really. I applied, and then they at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London,
Okay. Let's
EBRD.
just hold on a second. So while you were head of the council, the
Yeah,
Canadian Soviet um, Business Council,
Business Council.
you
Yeah.
were still in the Foreign Service.
Yes, they gave me an executive interchange,
Okay.
and I had written a letter of resignation, but then I got a call from the Public Service Commission. A guy said to me, "Young man, I think you've done some good work, but you're not very smart." I said, "I beg your pardon." I said, "Why are you calling me?" He said,
Yeah.
"Well, we can give you a leave without pay."
Ah, okay.
So I got that at the Business Council, and then I resigned again when I got the job at EBRD. And he called me again. He said, "You didn't learn anything. You can have another extension for up to 8 years, and then this is all pensionable time for you. So
Wow.
go for it." So I did. So,
Yeah.
so when I joined the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, I was technically on leave, authorized leave from the public service,
Uh-huh.
and so I started off as the deputy representative of the bank in Moscow for Russia,
Okay.
exclusively for Russia. And then the fellow they had appointed, a Swede, turned out to be a fraud. He could not speak Russian. He had studied Russian in the Swedish military, and so he was summarily fired. And I acceded to that post, and I spent another couple of years, well, more than that. January 94 to November 97, I became the top person for the EBRD
Indeed. And so the
in Russia.
EBRD had already been there and they had activities and you took it
Well,
over.
no,
No?
I was there at the opening.
You were
Uh,
at the opening.
yeah,
Okay.
at the
Okay.
same time. Now, Russia was a member since '91, but I was the one that opened the office
Oh,
in
okay.
Moscow. Okay.
In Moscow. Okay.
Yeah.
And what were you tasked to do by the EBRD? What did they want you to do in opening that office?
Uh, Principally to investigate opportunities for both financing and for technical assistance. To
Okay.
build a team, which I did,
Uh-huh.
and there, and then programs or projects had already been seeded, but there were no projects in progress. So
Okay.
I was the go-between for bankers from London who were not posted in Moscow. We didn't have
Uh-huh.
bankers for a few years, and then to try to develop new projects. Also, to liaise with the relevant ministries, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Finance, the Foreign Ministry, the Central Bank of Russia. And so I was basically, as the representative, I had to cover all those bases. And I recruited people. I even started a program for young Russian graduates, a
Mm.
program that we named the um, um, financial assistance team, and they were all English speakers, etc. And that was a tremendously successful program, which went on for about 10 years, even after I
Wow.
left.
Wow. Do you remember the very first project you funded?
I have it somewhere, but I didn't
Oh,
think.
okay. Okay. It wasn't memorable enough that it
Well,
was.
no, there were many memorable projects, but the very first one would have been a state to state or a project for reforms, technical
Oh,
assistance,
okay.
you
Okay.
Jeffrey Sachs and all of that. It was
All
very
right.
popular.
So how was your relationship with the OECD and USAID? I mean, you all were in the same space,
No,
kind of.
not really. No, because the
Okay.
OECD wasn't about to lend to. Well, they don't have a lending function, first of all.
Right. Okay.
Um, but the World Bank. I mean, I was close to the director of the World Bank because they were principally responsible for state to state or state loans.
Uh-huh.
EBRD was focused on the commercial projects, although we did have some technical assistance projects, which were not loans, they were grants from all the member countries that gave us money. So I
Uh-huh.
was involved in that. I was on a few boards representing the bank on technical assistance projects. And actual funding to private sector took longer than it should have.
Uh-huh.
But
Uh-huh.
here's a very important learning point. It did so because Russians were so inundated by these technical assistance evaluations and studies, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't know what to do with it.
Hmm.
What the bank and the West, en général, as they say in French, forgot to think about was that you're talking about concepts that people were really not familiar with, and
Mm-hmm.
so um, to try and I've got a great anecdote for you. Khodorkovsky, I don't know if you remember
Sure,
him.
of course. Yeah.
Well, Khodorkovsky came while I was still in Moscow for the EBRD. Came to my office at 7 o'clock at night with two guys in black shirts, black ties, black suits, etc. And he sat down and he said, "I want to start a bank." I said, "Well, that's very good, and I'd like the EBRD to invest." Eventually, he did start a bank, by the way, several banks, in fact. But
Right.
he said, "I want the EBRD to invest." I said, "Okay, so how much capital are you willing to put into this bank?" He said, "Oh, about $1 million." I said, "Okay, and do you have a business plan?" "No." "And how much would you like the EBRD to invest?" "The rest." I said, "How much is the rest?" You need a business plan, and we need to help you. We can help you with technical assistance funding to develop a proper business plan for you and whoever else is going to be party to this project. He said, "Well, how soon can that happen?" I said, "Well, it takes a while." "Well, I need the money next month." This is Khodorkovsky, not a stupid man.
Right.
Okay. And I said, That's not possible. So he left mad. Okay.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
Fast forward, when I went, I haven't got there yet, but it's important because this is illustrative, I think, of how the bank did failed in many respects. Russia. A few years later, when I was the representative of the EBRD in Russia, the number two guy in the bank, an American, said, "I want to go." No, it was Guy de Cellier, the number three guy. Guy is Belgian, and anyway, he was technically my boss in London. So I want to meet Khodorkovsky. So I arranged the appointment. Now, this was several years later, and he didn't come to me. He summoned us to his palace, Особняк, as it's called in Russian. And
Right.
so we walk in and we shake hands to everybody. Mind you, he didn't come out. He made us wait an hour and a half, and he had all these young guys in sharp suits. They were looked like newly minted MBAs, and so they finally we ascended to his palatial office and we shook hands. He says, "Вы помните меня?" I said, "Of course I do." So how do you think I've done without a business plan?
Wow.
Yeah, wow, he's right. And so I said, "Well, I congratulate you. All I can do." I said, "But you were talking to a bureaucrat, and
Yeah.
the EBRD bureaucracy. I explained to you, and I did it in your own language, and I don't know what else I could have done." And
Right.
you never got back to us. He says, "I don't need you anymore." So basically, the result of that meeting with the number three guy in the EBRD was nothing because
Yeah.
they had learned capitalism without the help of the EBRD,
Right.
or he
Right.
had at least.
He had,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, um, oh, that's interesting. So sort of some of the sort of American view was that Brzezinski, I think, was the one who most articulated this, that Russia was in receivership to the West and had to be taught how to develop. And, that sort of sense of the little brother, big brother sort of relationship, I think, characterized a lot of the 90s. And did you see that? Do you have any thoughts about that sort of attitude?
Yes. I mean, I won't say disgust, but my response was, "Are you people not listening?
Mm,
You people don't understand exactly the culture, the mentality of this country. You can't do a report because it'll go on the shelf and it'll never be read. And yet
right.
they continue to do that. The World Bank and OECD and everybody else did the same thing. So there were these psychological restrictions on both sides. The Russians said, "We don't need reports. We want your capital." And of
Hmm.
course, there is a practical barrier there. We can't give you capital if we don't know how you don't understand the business ethics. You don't understand exactly how it works. And we're not a gazillionaire with our own money. We're a public institution. So they didn't understand that, and our people really didn't fully understand. Now, to say that I fully understood myself would be an exaggeration, but I had this uneasy feeling that we were talking like this, and the EBRD would not eventually succeed. Individual projects, yes. Over the
Hmm.
time that I was employed by the bank, some individual projects were successful, but by and large, we didn't have the impact that Jacques Attali thought we could have when he
Uh-huh.
came up with this
So
brilliant report.
what was that impact? What when you say it wasn't successful, what would have success looked like if you had been successful? What did that mean?
Well, it would have been a more organized format for delivering a little bit of the help necessary, more pilot projects with the right Russian sponsors, people
Uh-huh.
like Khodorkovsky who were well turned out to be corrupt, but that's most of them were sadly, but a better mining job of getting the right people with the right attitudes and starting small and basically nurturing these these investments instead of trying to shotgun everything. We'll spend 200 million on studies, and then we might invest a little bit, but it never got to that stage, or at least to a economy of scale. It never reached that me while I was there.
Yeah, yeah,
To be
yeah,
honest. Now,
yeah.
I was responsible after I left Russia to work for the EBRD in London. I was responsible for a couple of projects, and Magnitogorsk Metal, the biggest steel company in former Soviet Union, was a client. And
Okay,
okay, I worked with a German banker, and we tried to develop a line of finance for them. And
right.
unfortunately, all of the other nice to haves like environmental controls and uh, a complete surgical review of their financing, etc. That put them off, and we offered this working capital facility. Wasn't big; it was $50 million or something, and they said no, we don't need the money because
Ah,
it
okay.
was just onerous in their view. But
Right.
it was a mistake to say that we're going to work with a giant like that always got the money that the Central Committee of the Communist Party uh, allocated to them. They didn't
Right.
want to
Right.
do the things that well, I mean, we weren't wrong. We just didn't go about it the right way, and we chose the wrong potential partners or recipients. And
Uh-huh.
that's a generalization, but that's certainly the
Okay.
impression I'm left
Interesting.
with 20 years later.
Interesting. I interviewed someone last week who was a consultant on that project and was a resident there in trying to put together the financials for, I guess, there were subcontractors way below your level at that time. But anyway, I'm just noting it because when we put the archive together, we'll put a link to that so that someone who's interested in that can follow up. But I mean, but isn't that, I mean, so my perception of big organizations like this is that you do big projects because overhead is the same for a big project as for a little project. And so, from the point of view of outsiders, doing a big project is better. It's a better measure of success than doing a little project that you have the same overhead and same due diligence costs as doing a big project. So, was it even conceivable that an organization, an institution that size could have done smaller demonstration projects like you're describing?
Well, they did. I mean, I
Okay,
don't want to be categoric. Some were done, but uh, a lot of emotional and financial effort was spent on trying to nail a big one that could be a real demonstration project. And you can't fault people for having that viewpoint
yeah,
for
right.
many of the practical reasons you suggest. Um, but by the same token, and hindsight is
Of course.
2020.
Yeah.
So, but I did. I'm not trying to pat myself on the back. I did feel uneasy personally because I
Uh-huh.
would see a lot of smaller people who came in and they were below our threshold, but I could see on a human level that this is a person. He's genuine. He's real. He's got a product. We need to be able to fund that, and of
Right.
course we couldn't necessarily. So there was this idea for lending to the nascent banking system, lending them money, um, and that didn't really work very well either
Uh-huh.
because the
Uh-huh.
due diligence. I mean, these banks had no track record. They had really no financial records. They had nothing to recommend them. But we'd give them 100 or 85,000 or whatever it was, and God knows what they did with the money because we didn't have the horsepower to monitor these loans.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
um, anyway, it was very frustrating. But on a personal level, um, I felt very pleased with what I and the people that I built the office with were doing, telling people straight up how we operate,
Right.
um, coming up with ideas how they could bring themselves to the point where they could approach either one of these sublenders or
Right.
or, or for larger projects to have Western expertise to help repackage. If you're telling them the truth in terms of your financials,
Right.
they will package it in the way that the bankers in London who would take these projects on would feel comfortable with, and the confidence level would rise, and then you could. So the Russians were not completely blameless. They wanted uh, pie and they wanted to eat it now, and they weren't prepared to educate themselves. Many of them that I met.
Right. Right. But do you think over time some of them did? I mean, they began to, did you see change in that sense?
Well, yes, I mean, it began and ended with privatization. Because
Okay.
no matter what you think about the voucher system and how the privatization program went on, if you look at some of these huge companies that are still owned by oligarchs or that have been nationalized, they learned very quickly. They learned very quickly, and of course, we didn't want to lend money to the Khodorkovskys or the others because of the well-founded suspicion that they didn't play by the rules, but you can't take a thousand-year-old culture and just because you're offering them some what in their view is peanuts, change the mentality. And maybe it was not a soluble problem, but it was really that fundamental that so those guys that however they did the privatization, they stole or cheated and got all the vouchers and bought these huge state companies at a huge discount. Um, they were the ones who demonstrated that they had the capacity. They certainly could marshal the technological skills, even the financial skills. I mean, this program that I mentioned earlier, this financial analyst program that we did for young Russians in the first couple of years of the office, that those people are absolutely brilliant. Today, I'm still in touch with some of them, and they have built huge fortunes and done wonderful things. They did it by themselves. They read a lot, but the 2 years, a year or two they spent at EBRD as financial analysts for projects that they were doing taught them a hell of a lot and gave them the confidence to try these things. So the cultural change, nobody should have expected it to happen in 10 or 12 years. It's taken 50 years, and maybe not 50, but 40 for sure.
Right, right. But there were certain business skills that people picked up fairly quickly, in just in terms of skills. I'm not talking about ethics or a sort of broader view, but the understanding of the concepts and practices of a market economy were picked up relatively quickly, right?
It's as simple as buy low, sell high. I mean,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
really is that simple. And those people who had the initiative and the courage, I suppose, to build stuff without the nuisance expectations and forms to be filled in that the EBRD wanted, or the IFC for that matter, or
Uh-huh.
or the German technical assistance facility and the British and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I look on those years that I was at EBRD, is it 8 years or 7 years? I look at it as for me a huge learning uh, program. I learned a lot. I hope I certainly I believe we had a very strong relationship because I was a relationship manager, not first and foremost, but to a large extent. And the doors were always open. I was well received in the central bank, in the Ministry of Economy, and everywhere else. And I represented the bank, but I think the way that you communicate makes a big difference, and in which language you communicate. When we had
Uh-huh.
our very senior people come, and they had to have an interpreter with them, the relationship wasn't the same.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course they weren't there enough or frequently enough or long enough to develop any relationships while being resident there. And we eventually got some Western expatriates, EBRD bankers to be embedded in the office, and the projects started to move better when that happened. But that was towards the end of my time in Moscow, and then I went to London for a couple of years, for 3 years actually.
When did you leave Moscow?
I left the EBRD Moscow office in November of '97.
97. You
Yeah.
left before the crash. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then I was on the Russia team in London, and that was a very sad time for me, to be honest, because you're I the only people you see are your colleagues and your superiors who are impatient.
Right.
And the projects that I worked on, very few of them actually moved, and it was hard to. And I was never trained as a banker, so I had some limitations. I was more of a relationship banker than I was a financial banker. So
Uh,
that was apparent to me, and is clearly apparent to my bosses because I didn't last much longer. That was 94 to 97. Anyway, um, no, that was in Russia. And then 97 to 2000 is when I
right.
left EBRD.
You left EBRD in 2000.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I was
And
there
you were
for,
living in London then while
I
you,
was living in London. They wanted to send me these anecdotes. I won't bore you with too many, but they wanted to send me back to Moscow after having let me live in London for 3 years.
right.
And I said, but I don't want to go and run that office anymore. Well, actually, you won't be running the office because this person, you'll be reporting to this person. I said, I beg your pardon?
Yeah.
Oh, well, she's Serbian and she speaks Russian. Well, I knew her and she spoke Russian as well as I speak Swahili, which is not at all. And she
Yeah.
could say
Yeah.
hello and goodbye and things like that. So I said, no, I refuse. And then because I refused, they basically, there was no room for me. There was a position in Belarus. They didn't want to send me there. There were other things. And I had someone come up to me and say, look, you've been blackballed.
Okay.
And that hit like a ton of bricks. But I said, well, thanks for being honest. That's what I suspected. And so
Yeah.
that was not a very good time the last few months that I was there. But if you remain, let's say, not optimistic but undefeated,
Yeah.
and through sheer accident, I got a call from my former assistant at the EBRD Moscow office, and she says, "Oh, we have this guy in the office here. It's Visa International, the credit card company and
Right.
payment system, and would you be interested in talking to them because they're looking for someone to open up the representation in Russia?" I said, "Sure, I'll talk to him." So I talked to him. And within 8 days, I had a firm job offer from Visa. And my wife wasn't that happy. We were leaving a wonderful house in Woking, Surrey, to go back to
Yeah.
Moscow. We had two children, two adopted children, and one of them had serious mental challenges. And so we did go back to Moscow. And I spent the next 7 years at Visa. When I got there, there were approximately 800,000 debit cards, and they were issued initially during the Olympics in Seoul.
Oh, okay.
And so our job was to develop the market. And so the reason I say this is my favorite job is because basically Visa didn't know what the hell to do. And they said,
Right.
here, you do it. And with some very smart advice and very capable colleagues and a team around me, we realized that the way to uh, propagate the electronic payments, was to go to the large factories who paid their employees in paper bags, cash, rubles.
Okay. And this
Okay,
is still in 2000. In 2000, they're still
yeah.
doing this. Right.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so they were basically unbanked. Maybe 20% people actually kept real money in banks. And so I crossed the country talking to these facilities, explaining how much they could save in manpower, and by controlling where the money went when they paid people electronically, and then
Yeah.
they would have a debit card, payment card, with tied to their accounts. And women, I did a number of road shows, and we talked about it, and women were delighted because they knew that their factory working husbands couldn't drink the money before the wife got her hands on it to buy groceries.
Right. Right.
So that was I have to say, just on a personal level and a professional level, that was the most satisfying thing to know that my team and I, helped really stimulate banking in Russia, and literally hundreds of thousands, maybe more, of people over the 7 years I was in charge of that office. became banked. They learned about payment cards. I mean, Russian technology people were further ahead because they'd already thought about the chip card, and we were still in North America using the whatever you call that, the press machine,
Magnetic strip thing.
magnetic
Yes.
strip.
Yeah.
So we went from the 800,000 cards that were being used at all to 43 million cards.
Wow.
43 million cards in
Wow.
7 years, and about 800,000 credit cards, because we started to introduce credit cards as well as the
Uh-huh.
banking system matured. And everybody, in fact, I got a death threat from, I'm trying to remember his name. He was a very famous but very shady banker in Russia, because I kicked him out of the Visa. Visa was not a corporation then; it was a Commonwealth. It was basically I don't know what you'd call it, but and I had discretion, so he wasn't meeting his targets. He didn't do anything that we wanted to, like increasing the number of point of sale terminals and etc. And I said, sorry, we're going to pull your license. He said, well, I'm bringing 20 new banks into the system. I said, they're not ready yet. And he said, you better watch yourself because I'm out to get you.
Mm.
Осторожно, мы смотрим на тебя.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So I said, okay, well, I'll meet you out on the street. Okay, come on. I'll be out there by myself. Let's see
Yeah.
what you can do. Well, he hung up the phone. He never followed up. He and his shady banks were out of the system, but we went from something like 60 banks to, Russian banks proliferated in that time, but we
Right.
many more banks, and the volumes that were actually being spent on our cards just exponentially grew, and financial literacy was a big deal. So I got involved with the Princess Trust in the UK, and we did a whole campaign funded by the Princess Trust, on financial literacy for middle and senior public school students. And
Uh-huh.
that was really so well received that I accepted a nominee from the Ministry of Economic Development on the steering committee of this initiative. And
Uh-huh.
then that initiative led to the creation of a financial literacy department in the Ministry of Economic Development.
Wow. Wow.
So, though I mean, you can hear in my voice how enthusiastic and proud I was of what our small team did. I didn't hire anybody who came from the banking system. I hired young people, people who knew about computers, people who knew about telecoms, and people
Right.
with the personality to solicit banks to join and to encourage the clients of these banks, industrial clients, to move salary payment to the banks. So
And so this whole changes the way people shop, the way people live, their it changes so much of the experience of life by making this change. And you kind of jumped over the stage of writing checks. You went from cash to cards
yeah,
without checks in between.
they never had checks in Russia.
Right.
And
Yeah.
they had telephone banking long before we did in Canada, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah.
They once they got the taste of what they could do and how to meld technology with finance, they just were flying. They were flying. So much so that we had some competing payment systems sprout from nowhere, and they all hoped that we would buy them out and they could be part of the Visa system. No, and obviously that was not in our interest. We had to make Visa. We crushed MasterCard, by the way. They were there before us.
Uh-huh.
And my CEO at that time at Visa Europe was a former MasterCard executive, and she said, "Oh, I'm so proud of you, Lou. You crushed those bastards." And I said that wasn't my intent, but what Visa did for financial literacy, for getting cash out of the economy, that would be my legacy, I guess. Now, I wasn't alone. I had a great team. I had a lot of support from our president and from other executives in London, to which I reported. But I also applaud a lot of the Russian banks because I was chairman of the Visa Russia Association of the member banks. And we had regular meetings, and it was a serious organization. And we came up with initiatives, and they checked up on what we were doing in terms of new technologies, et cetera, et cetera. And for a Canadian kid to be the chair, having all these bank chairmen. I mean, they weren't bankers their entire lives, but
Right.
they had the guts to start banks. I took a lot of pride in that as well.
Yeah, and so you it wasn't just that. Well, it sounds like some of your success was your attitude, your relationship focus, and
Yes.
how and meeting them where they were. But at the same time, it wasn't you imposing systems on them as much as them buying in and being partners in changing the way the whole financial system worked. Am I reading that properly?
Absolutely. In fact, and we had a very tense time with the anti-monopoly committee because we encouraged banks, and everybody wanted to be part of Visa, but we needed minimum capital requirement, we needed multiple branches, we needed a demonstration that they would actually be spokespeople for the growth of the system. And one banker from the Urals um, took me, or at least engaged the anti-monopoly committee, which opened a case against us and me personally because we had disqualified his little bank from membership, and and so we spent a long time, and we baffled them with our 2,000 page operating rules. So when we had this hearing at the guy was great, the deputy head of the anti-monopoly committee. It turned out he was a friend. We had dinner a few times after this was all settled. Um, he understood that an organization needs rules, and you can't let an under capitalized bank that could fail any moment join an organization because it affects everybody else, including the Visa
Right.
brand. So we had this final meeting, and there was people, investigators from the anti-monopoly committee. There was a representative of the complainant from the Urals, and we had prepared a summary of these 2,000 pages and explained the logic. And then we had a break, and the deputy head of the monopoly committee took me aside. He said, "Look, we need to do something to show that we've actually I understand what you're doing. So what I'd like you to do is to put on your website something that was already there, the general requirements for joining Visa." And we already had it there. I said, "Of course, we'll do that right away."
Right.
So this guy, the complainant, never became a Visa member while I was there, at least.
Yeah.
And the anti-monopoly committee got to pat itself on the back that forcing Visa
That
to be
they force.
transparent.
Right. Yeah.
We were
Yeah.
always transparent. Just this guy
Right.
didn't like our rules
Right.
and thought that it was a utility and that we couldn't deny him. Well, Visa was not a utility; it was a business,
Right.
and it was a cooperative at the time. But in 2006, it went public, and all the banks bought up all the shares, and so it was then a bank-owned institution. But prior to that, it was a cooperative. The banks
Oh, okay.
so anyway, nobody understood what Visa was. I certainly didn't when I said I.
Well, you were perceived as foreigners, though. That had to be part of it, right?
Well, there's a rub. I'm glad you raised that because my there were no predecessors. Well, we had a predecessor. He was a British guy. He would go and have fun in Moscow and come back to London, but he never did anything. So when they decided to open the office, it was a serious. And I interviewed everybody that I hired, and the first six people, and then when I left, there were 65 people in the office.
Hmm.
But the point is that now I forgot my point.
About being foreigners.
Oh, right, about being foreign. So I heard that a lot, and I did a lot of interviews. I had a great PR person, and this is all in Russian, of course. And I said, look, my philosophy is to be the most international of Russian payment systems. What do you mean? I said, just watch. So we sponsored the Russian junior ice hockey team, and in that year, the Russian team won the world championship, and it was in Halifax, in Nova
Oh.
Scotia. So I had all my Canadian friends shitting all over me. Pardon the expression. What are you doing that for? I said, well, because people like you noticed that
Yeah.
we have Visa on their helmets, and then We sponsored the Russian Golf Federation. We did all these things, and there was no condescension. Nobody was speaking English to them through an interpreter. Everybody in the team was well, not everybody was Russian, but everybody was fluent in Russian.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So,
Uh-huh.
and we encouraged viable regional banks to join and to make them feel welcome. Unlike this guy in the Urals who was a PRICK, but they were
Yeah.
people who followed the rules. And so we went from 30 banks to, I think at the end before I left, it was about 460 banks were our members. Or I can't remember that may be a wrong figure, but it was by multiples. We grew,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
system
Yeah.
and the volumes of spend on the cards kept going up and up and up and up. And Visa was happy, and so happy that when I went back for my last 2 years in the company, I was still in charge of the former Soviet Union, but I was also head of strategy. And so some of the strategies that we applied in Russia, I encouraged the regional managers to do in other emerging markets. And so I always tell everybody that was the best job I ever had because I
Yeah.
had supportive management, and basically I made my own decisions. And knock on wood, they turned out to be successful.
That's fantastic. It's a fantastic story, um, and interestingly, because part of the narrative of Russian business is they don't want to follow rules, uh, rogue behavior here and there and everywhere. And yours is a story of a larger and larger number of banks collaborating for their mutual benefit in changing the system, right?
Very much so. One other, if I may, another anecdote.
Sure.
In Uzbekistan, I went there a few times, and we grew the market there, in Georgia and other places. And there was um, a former Soviet citizen who had emigrated to Austria, and he was involved somehow in a proprietary payment card scheme. And he was, my suspicion was, and I'm sure it was true, he was bribing the chairman of the the main bank in Uzbekistan, state owned,
Uh-huh.
to use their cards.
Mm.
And he was charging $120 for the piece of plastic per card. The exchange fees were really high. The processing fees were really high. And one of the Uzbek bankers sent me the pro forma offer and said, "You might want to read this." And so I read it. And I said, "Oh, this is terrible." So I flew to Tashkent again and went to see the head of the central bank and then the deputy minister of finance. And I said, "Well, here's our value proposition. Cards cost 30 to 60 cents, depending on whether it's a magnetic strip or a chip card. These are our rules, translated into Russian for them to read, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you tell me what's better." So the guy changed his mind, and the expatriate Russian from Vienna calls Visa headquarters in San Francisco, and he says, "You have to fire Naumovski." And they said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, one of our senior people, this is an executive VP, turned out to be a phenomenal guy, former U.S. military. He's going to be in Moscow. You should go and talk." So the guy comes in, and I'm sitting there with this senior person from Visa in San Francisco, and the Russian fellow says, "I want him out of the room," talking about me. I said, and my colleague says, "No fucking way." And he used that word.
Yeah.
And he says, he runs this business. He's got to be here. So the guy was complaining, and so I had prepared a brief for this fellow from San Francisco, and he said, "Well, you're charging huge amount of money for a card we charge 60 cents for. You have these exchange fees that we don't have, and you're telling the Uzbek Ministry of Finance that you're a better bet." He
Right.
says, "Get out of this office before I kick you out."
Wow.
The guy left with his tail between his legs, never heard a thing again. And Uzbekistan now has the third largest number of cards in the former Soviet Union after Russia and Ukraine. So
Wow.
it's been
Wow.
it's, and of course they've had a lot of reforms as well, which made it much easier. But so
Yeah,
these are
right.
the, this
And
is
so you started with these debit cards as a way of transferring salary, but mostly people in the U.S. think of credit cards as the primary thing about this plastic payment system. So you must have had different standards then for the banks to issue credit cards, or what was the
well,
difference and how did that work?
fundamentally the financial strength of the bank is all that interested us,
Okay.
and how they applied our rules and what kind of rules they had in terms of to whom would they issue a credit card. Now, it was their loss. It wasn't Visa's loss. Visa never
Okay.
takes a loss. It's the issuing card and the car the bank or the issuing bank or the receiving bank. They're the ones who take the risk. So their standards were very high in terms of Russians and credit cards. Now Russia has millions of credit cards. It's didn't take them very long.
Right,
And
right, right.
so our standards were really we wanted the right banks, solvent banks. We did reputational diagnostics. We had consultants that did that for us, and we didn't want to be caught up in any reputational crisis. So for us, if they had enough capital and they wanted to issue credit cards, and if they had their own systems for vetting depositors and clients, that was fine. So, but it was still more risky than debit cards,
Yeah.
and as a
Yeah.
consequence, it couldn't grow as fast, but it has skyrocketed in the last.
And did these cards become a significant factor in the Russian banks growing themselves?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Very much so, because if you had Visa on your cards, as opposed to there were Russian debit card systems which were laughable, just like the one that this fellow from Vienna tried to sell the Uzbeks, and so it became prestigious. They saw it on the hockey helmets. They saw it on in television commercials that we did. And our strap line was the most international of Russian payment systems. How could you?
fantastic. Yeah,
And
yeah,
and and they and that worked, and other sponsorships we did, etc., put us in the public eye. I don't know how many interviews I gave. I got three cartons full at my cottage of my press activity, etc. And there was a strengthening of trust in the banks, and even more if it was a Visa card and not a local branded card.
right, right.
So
So this was sort of a period in which the banking system moved out of these pocket banks and oligarch, sort of private banks into a more significant banking sector that served the population that grew beyond Sberbank.
they're not mutually exclusive because
Okay,
some of these new banks or zero banks, um, unlike, there was Finestort Bank and Sberbank and other
right.
state-owned facilities, and they are all issuing cards too, by the way.
There
Sberbank
was
has,
issuing Visa cards.
oh
Yes.
yeah, but
Yeah.
they started off with their own proprietary debit cards. But many of the prominent commercial, privately owned banks still had a link to their original oligarchic roots. And
Hmm.
so, as far as we were concerned, if their capital adequacy checked out, if we did the reputational diagnosis that we had to do according to Visa rules, were we taking risks? Well, we were taking risks by being in Russia, period. So,
Right.
in relative terms, I mean, we, as far as I know, by the time I left, we had no losses ever in Russia, ever.
Ever. Okay.
So
Okay.
something might have happened that I haven't been paying attention to, but
Sure. Sure. And so you were there until 2007. Then you went back to London for 2000.
2007, I was in London, and I was both head of strategy for the um, Africa and Middle East and Eastern Europe region, senior VP, and then I was also still head of the Moscow office. And I got it. I wasn't headhunted. I was recommended for a job in the mining industry. And so
Huh.
I had an
That's a
interview.
big change. That's a big
No,
change.
I never thought I'd be a bank card person or anything, any of that. But so I get a phone call from my former secretary at Visa from Moscow, and she says, I had this guy here, and they're looking for somebody for a Canadian company called Kinross Gold. They want to open an office in Russia, and they're looking for somebody with, and you're a Canadian, you're the first person I could think of. I said, great, I'll talk to the guy.
Oh, can I just stop for a
Sure.
second? Visa wasn't Canadian based, right?
No, Visa's always San Francisco's the world
Yeah.
headquarters.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just happened to be a guy in London that they called when I joined.
Okay. Okay.
So
So
that was
now we're moving forward. The fact that you're Canadian is a plus, obviously, for
well,
this.
it's yeah, they weren't looking for a Canadian necessarily, but
Okay.
because I was Canadian, I'd been in Russia for 25, however many years it was. Um, um, so when she gave me his phone number, I called the guy and I sent him my CV, and within a week, I had a new job offer. So
Uh-huh.
I went to back to the president who had supported me really strongly, and I said to her, "I really don't want to leave, but what I'd like to do in recognition for all of our success is if you would give me responsibility for the Balkan countries." Why? I said, well, because I speak Macedonian, Serbo-Croatian,
Right.
and I have a passion for my cultural background. And if I don't achieve what I've achieved in the percentage terms, uh, you can fire me after a year.
Uh-huh.
She says, "Oh, I can't really disappoint Tony." This fellow who was doing nothing in the region, but they had been together at Mastercard, and so said, "So you feel more loyalty for Tony than to me?" And at that point, I had four offers from Kinross Gold, and the
Uh,
last one, because they kept upping the amounts, and for me, they just my
right.
knees were spinning. And I said, "Okay, I have to tell you that I'm looking at an offer here, and it's the fourth offer that this company has given me. And I'll ask you one more time. Could you please consider and give me I'll give you a week to think about it." She says, "No, I can't disappoint Tony." I said, "Well, then you've disappointed me." And I said something really uncharitable to her, and I hung up. I signed the offer from Kinross Gold, and I joined Kinross, and I was there for 10 years. Um,
Wow.
Now, well, I didn't know anything about gold mining. They put me on a 1 week program just so I wouldn't be completely illiterate. But
Right.
what we achieved in Russia, for me, every job I've had has had the same challenges and the same objectives. Build a team, understand what you're talking about, um, develop a reputation that's beyond reproach, and your interpersonal and communication skills will get you to the end.
Mhm.
And so people laughed the fact that I had no mining background. Uh, well, as they
When you
did,
say people, what people? Russians or
Russians,
foreigners? Russians. Yeah.
Russians laughed.
Yeah.
In Russians in the mining industry.
Right.
The head of the Exploration Society of Russia, this 80-year-old crusty old guy, uh, he almost spit in my face when we met. And by the end of well, I think he was still alive when I left, but he couldn't say enough nice things about me because of the way we positioned Kinross
Uh-huh.
in Russia as a partner, not as a capitalist raider, but we were a partner. Yes, we had the mining license. Yes, we mined gold, and the value went back to Canada. The shareholders benefited, but so did the thousands of Russians who worked for us, and the
Mhm.
and the and the way we took care of the Russians, the health and safety, the opportunities they had. We had very few expats on the mining area.
So when you started with them, did they already have operations there, or you
They
opened?
had, yeah, no, they had going back a few years. There were other Canadian miners, junior miners as they're called, but Kinross is a full-fledged multi-million ounce producer globally. So they had purchased one of these smaller mines from a Canadian, and they
Okay.
were going to expand. And the
Okay.
first few months that they were trying to operate, they realized that they had nobody in Moscow. And the Ministry of Environment and Mining was in Moscow, and all the relevant the finance ministry and all the people that had to were key for monitoring and approving projects and etc. were in Moscow, and so
Okay.
that's why they were looking for somebody. Even though I
Well,
knew nothing,
where was the mine?
mine was in Chukotka, and
Okay. Okay.
and
The other end
above
of the
the
earth. Right.
above no hell the Urals are too close. This is above the
Right.
Arctic Circle.
No, I mean the other end of the earth.
Oh, the Earth. Yeah, sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
So it was a very, how can I put it? For me, I had nothing to lose. I was going to give it a try, and then something else would come up. At that point I was quite confident because of the successes that I'd had, and so I took another risk. And our experience, Kinross experience, and my personal experience in Russia was extremely positive, absolutely extremely positive. And how did we achieve that? Well, communications. There wasn't some Canadian engineer or geologist sitting in an office who couldn't communicate in the language. It was a guy that had done a lot in PR and government relations, and I just followed the pattern that I had established in previous jobs. I met the right people. I didn't bribe anybody. I didn't do anything. I didn't even initially, I didn't even take them for dinner. If they said no, I would never invite them again. So it was establishing these relationships. But the key, and this is probably why Kinross would be my second favorite career change. The key was sharing Canadian experience, and because they looked up to Canadian mining. They looked up to the Canadian capital markets for funding mining. They knew that they had problems with their regulations in terms of how you find, how you stake claims, how you develop mines, and what you need to do it properly. And Canada is well known globally for that. So it wasn't my idea, but my CEO at the time said, so why don't we try to help Russians do better in mining? Lou, what do you think are the gaps? And so I enumerated the gaps in terms of they had no regulations for claim staking. Everything was tightly controlled. You had to go through so many bureaucracies. And he said, so why don't you put together a team and let's develop some, we'll call them white papers for what we do in Canada and in other mining jurisdictions. Get it done in Russian, and then have meetings with Russian officials. So that's what we did over a year and a bit.
Okay.
We basically made it accessible for them to understand what are the key mining regulations in Canada that makes staking a claim, getting permission to start drilling, and closing, right to mine closing. What do Canadians do? So we did this in 3 white papers that we developed over 4 years, and that bought us so much goodwill. And I became a member of the Russian Mining Society. We had a mining club that Kinross sponsored, and so we had other miners and geologists and associations join us to talk about the Canadian experience and what could benefit the Russians. In our first white paper, we had, I think it was 14 recommendations. Things like how do you stake claims? How do you determine who has license to property? Things that Canada does relatively well. And of those 14 recommendations, within 2 years, the Russians had adopted 9.
Wow.
And then I would go to mining shows, etc., and I said, I got some good news for the Russian audience. It took Canada decades to achieve the level of mining regulation, the light touch that we have, but respecting resource development, respecting environmental concerns, etc. And you've done it faster. It took us decades. You did it in just a few years.
Yeah.
And the Russians couldn't believe it, and they did. And that's a legacy, not necessarily mine, but it's a Kinross
Right,
legacy.
right.
Kinross was kicked out of there like everybody else. They bought Kinross assets on 10 cents on the dollar. So,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
then again, they bought other mines owned by Russians for the same ratio. But in any event, so that does have a lasting benefit. And
yeah. So it was you were there from then from 2000 and what, 9?
2007 to 2017.
Oh, 10 years you were with
Yeah,
Kenrock. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. The
And
last year was in Toronto, just twiddling my thumbs, just to.
yeah,
But the first 9 years were just spectacular.
yeah. And the mines expanded during that period, the amount of
Well, yeah,
minerals that you
yeah.
were
Production was projected, and so they kept. I mean, there has to be an ongoing process of exploration
right,
and confirming deposits that you suspect are there. More drilling, looking at surrounding parcels of land, and then just before I left, they bought another asset further south, west from Chukotka, and so the things were going very very well for them, and they were until they got booted out. And
right, right. So was Roman Abramovich the governor of Chukotka while you were there?
no, he had left, and there was a delightful young man who was not even 40, uh, who was handpicked by Abramovich. He was very easy to work with. He helped us a lot. And he also benefited from the fact that there was well, the only serious foreign investor in Russian mining,
Uh-huh.
the
The
only
only,
Canadian
really,
company at the
seriously, yeah.
moment. The only, there were explorers, but nobody was producing like we were. And we kept exploring, et cetera, et cetera. And so he was very pleased. We not only did we pay a lot in taxes, but we also had a very proactive and successful program of assisting indigenous people in Chukotka.
Uh-huh.
I was
Uh,
very, very proud of that, and I contributed to that. And so our corporate social responsibility, which is no longer a clean word, it's I think a lot of people in the U.S. in particular don't like that concept, but it worked wonders for us.
uh-huh.
And we had so many visits from Russian miners. What is the key to your success? Well, here's what we do, but it's a culture change, and you're maybe not ready yet to have this culture change. And we were well regarded by the various indigenous tribes, the Chukchi and the Evenks and the others remember, this is above the Arctic Circle,
Sure,
and
sure.
Canada knew how to build ice roads, or Canadian companies
Ah,
ice
right.
roads, and we also treated our employees, both senior and run-of-the-mill miners, very, very well. Uh,
Uh-huh.
the, the, in relative terms, we had fewer Canadians or expats working in that mine than we did in mines in Brazil.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Huh.
Well, they're in Africa again, but they were Africa when I started, and then they left for a few years. But
Right.
anyway, it's another example of the value that a company can bring. And I think as a theme from all the jobs that I've had, you bring value beyond the amount of your investment,
Right.
but how you treat people, how you bring them along, how you give them responsibility, and uh, and how you let them sometimes make their own mistakes, but be there with some guardrails to help.
Right. Right. So did you personally travel to mine site often? Yeah.
Well, in the years that I was there, in 10 years, I think I went 6 or 7 times.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it was a camp. There was nothing around.
Right.
We had
And
these.
it was a year-round operation?
Oh yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. I was there both
So
in summer and in the heart of
in winter. And how did you get your production out in the winter?
by plane.
By plane. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. We had our own landing strip.
Yeah.
Um, we would take the nuggets and melt them down to the. I've forgotten a lot about my
Right.
experience, but
But you
then,
process the mined ore
well,
and you
yeah,
took
no, we
out.
took them to refineries. So
Yeah.
we had semi-refined clumps of gold that we
Yeah.
would fly out to a refinery, usually in the Urals. There are several refiners that we used. There was one in Chukotka the guy was a real crook. So they tried using him for a while and then decided to refine the gold in the Ural Mountains. So that's how we got it, and we sold a lot of it to the central bank,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
most of it to the central bank, and very little was exported. So it was a
Ah,
virtuous cycle.
okay. Okay. So, and they paid you in Canadian dollars or US
No, the
dollars?
US dollar
US
denomination. So
dollars. Okay.
gold
Okay.
gold market works.
Right.
So
So let me ask you, I know, for many people who are active in business in that period, there was an assumption that Russia had been integrated into the world trading system and that integration was irreversible, that was the new reality. Did you feel that as you in those years that you were particularly, with the Visa and Kinross years?
to be honest, I was as easily duped as everyone else,
Uh-huh.
and even more so because I was there, and I saw, I heard, I tasted what I thought was maybe not totally irreversible, but and one of the main factors was the quality of the public service, the Russian bureaucrats. I mean,
Uh-huh.
there were some brilliant people in the Ministry of Natural Resources that I dealt with they knew more about Canadian mining rules than most Canadian miners. They were so well technologically savvy, and they were different people from the ones that I worked with at EBRD.
Uh-huh.
Democrats. They had learned so much so quickly. So I was very, very confident. And especially when I saw how quickly they implemented the reforms that we had suggested to them at Kinross.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, yeah, this is pretty durable, pretty irreversible. Now, having spent that long away from my wife and children, I wanted to come back.
Yeah.
And
So
I
they
did.
weren't living in Moscow with you at that time? No.
No,
Okay.
I mean, the company was very generous, so I could go every couple of months, come home every
Yeah,
couple of months. But it took a toll on the family, especially
sure.
my sons are now 37 and 32. They had some challenges in adolescence that I wasn't there to help with. Excuse me. So, yeah, I did think it was irreversible, and I was fooled, principally by one person, Vlad,
Uh-huh.
Vladimir Putin. Um,
Yeah.
I met him multiple times.
Uh-huh.
And the first time I met him was when he was still in the civic government in St. Petersburg when I was with EBRD. And then over the times that I was with Kinross in particular, I met him frequently at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum and in smaller groups, the Investment Advisory Council, which Kinross had a major role in starting. And he fooled me. I wasn't the only one fooled by him, but
Right,
his
right.
record
Well, let,
on
let me ask you, do you think you were fooled or do you think he changed?
uh, a leopard doesn't change his spots, right? But he could
Okay.
be good at masquerading. I've struggled with this question over the years, to be honest. Um, but his language, his demeanor, his he read his briefings, and when he came to meet with us in the Foreign Investment Advisory Council, um, he knew exactly what each of the members, Kinross included. I got Kinross involved in that organization that I helped create when I was at EBRD. So I mean, there are all these threads, and so Kinross was desperate to join. They joined, and so the two CEOs that I worked or reported to were both thrilled at this because they could tell their buddies in the country club that they had drinks with Putin. And anyway, the point is that he said all the right things. Putin did. He did all the right things, supporting foreign investment. And what happened to me as a former political science student, I had these built-in blinkers, and so I
Uh-huh.
didn't see or I didn't fully appreciate what he was doing uh, contemporaneously. What he was doing was planting all of these uh, supporters, former FSB, former military intelligence, former, etc., building this wall around him. And we were so focused on what we thought was commercial success and how things had radically changed and improved that I'm not the only one. I meet colleagues that were there at the same time, and they confess the same blindness that we had, that we didn't step back and really pay attention, not so much to the corruption, because thank God, I knock on wood, I'd never succumbed, never was rarely approached and never succumbed. Some of my compatriots did, but we just refused to see that on the political level, um, Russians themselves were no better off. There
Mhm.
was no opportunity for any kind of public engagement in anything. Uh, the party was totally irrelevant. It was the cult of the personality that took over, and his ability to um, draw people in and dispose of people that were no longer drinking the Kool-Aid. This isn't Kool-Aid, by the way. This
Yeah.
is um, they and so yeah, I got fooled, and a lot of people got fooled. Uh, so I have to say that that was a big disappointment to me. But I'm a cynic. I'm a Slav. I'm a pessimist, and that all goes hand in hand.
Right.
But I allowed myself to be not quite euphoric, but extremely buoyant and very, very satisfied that we were, those of us who were there, were able to, in some way or another, support the transition. And we felt that it was irreversible. Putin had other ideas, but to your point, did he change? Perhaps, but politically he changed very early on when he told Bill Clinton that he thought maybe Russia could be a candidate for the G20 or the G10 as it was then,
Yeah, right, right.
G7.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously they didn't qualify, but he took umbrage then, and especially when he read later on that Clinton laughed as he told the story.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
So he's diabolical,
Yeah.
Putin. He's diabolical. He's dangerous. He uses people. He doesn't. Of course, he has a lot of people around him, but those that he was in service in the FSB with, not all of them have escaped unscathed. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but the
Yeah.
ones that he has, and so a lot of my acquaintances and friends say, "So how can he be deposed?" I said, the only people who get close enough to him are the young guards that he has that are, surround him all the time. And they're either too stupid to try or too scared. So
Yeah.
no one
Yeah.
else is going to get to this guy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's there as long as he doesn't die from
Yeah.
some
Right.
syphilitic ailment.
Right. 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 Well, but also say politically, I understand what you're saying, um, but I want to look at this in terms of economic changes. And I mean, the Soviet Union was a centrally planned economy, and Russia became a market economy. And it is I think, as a posit, that it is a Russian market economy, but nonetheless still a market economy, even though many of the foreigners have been kicked out, not all. And that has given it some of the flexibility to deal with sanctions and the economic pressure that has come from the West, but that it's not it is not a centrally planned economy, but a market economy with a heavy presence by the state. I, and I'm putting that to you as a thesis, and I'm trying to see
Yeah,
do you agree with that, or do you disagree, and what do you think about that formulation of the current
yeah.
economy?
I yeah, no, I agree. 98% perhaps, maybe even
Yeah,
to 100. Yes, it's a market economy, but with more interference than other market economies.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
and is also a hostage to political decisions like the war in Ukraine, which diverts state funds away from, because the place I haven't been since December of 2016, and I'm a a citizen of an unfriendly country and cannot get a visa to go there unless I say I want to be treated in a Russian clinic, God forbid, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so I think it's the problem if this continues. I mean, he's not going to live forever,
Right.
but it'll be a tumultuous change of power, and there's just I wouldn't put any money on some form of pluralistic democracy emerging. So
Mhm.
I guess I'm now I've reversed my earlier views, the euphoria about on the economic level how I was able and my teams and my companies were all able to benefit from, but also support the transition in Russia. So I'm no longer optimistic. Um, I'm hopeful, but I don't see. In order to be more optimistic, you need to see a number of different scenarios that could emerge that would right the wrongs that have been going on since 2016,
Yeah, yeah,
17.
yeah.
This is, and I don't see where that could come from. There's no civil society. There's no opposition. There is no reasonable. There's just no reason, period, or no hope for any kind of uprising because of the very oppressive structure with multiple defense or military organizations, and so getting rid of Putin, if it were ever possible, doesn't really change a lot because there's going to be um, a fight for the keys to the Kremlin. A lot of people are going to die mysteriously, some not so mysteriously.
Right.
The military has been emasculated. They're losing so many people in Ukraine that they have commissioned officers on the front lines who get killed, and it's it's a terrible scenario for Russia. As much as it pains me to say that, I was an optimist, although I
Yeah.
claim to be a pessimist because of the
Right.
experience that I had. But looking at everything that's happened, both economically and politically, I can't see in my lifetime a real change. I mean, Putin's 10, 11 years older than I am, but uh, he's got better medical care than I do.
You right, 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 right. Well, so when we started this interview, I gave you, kind of a set of questions, and I'm sure it caused you to think about things, but I want to make sure that I've covered uh, everything that you wanted to say as far as this, and I want to make sure. I think you kind of have a sense we're near the end of this interview, but I want to see if there are things that you wanted to talk about or anecdotes even that you wanted to tell that you didn't because of the flow of how our conversation has gone. So, anything you want to add?
Yes, in fact, specifically on point three, the
Okay.
frequency and the nature of my contact. I mean, I'm a pretty open person, and my wife says I talk too much. You probably would agree after 2.5 hours.
No, not at
Uh,
all. Not at all.
I felt that there was simpatico between me and most Russians that I knew and met and worked with. Um, I felt I earned their respect and their admiration in many ways, and I didn't do so in a calculating way. I just again, starting from the very beginning, I felt simpatico, and when I when we first went to Russia, my wife and I, she's Anglo-Saxon, Irish, English, Scottish ancestry, and she never learned to speak Russian well, and she was often to the side because she couldn't communicate with these other people, and she wouldn't really stop me because she saw how I could ingratiate myself with them, not deliberately, but just wanted to have
Right.
more a more meaningful kind of relationship. So I found I thought I differentiated myself from a lot of the expats who were there at the same time, even those who married Russian girls and were there because they didn't really have the benefit of the my cultural linguistic background. And so how deeply did I get involved in Russian life? Well, very deeply. I had a lot of Russian friends, not just my colleagues or employees, but people that I felt I could open up to, and I didn't worry about whether they were going to rat me out or what have you. I just spoke from the heart, as I have today with you. I felt very, very, very comfortable. Now, um, I wasn't prepared to accept sort of the hardships of Russian life when we were there the first time. We tolerated them, and of course we were working in an embassy, so it wasn't as bad for us as it was for these people waiting in line to buy oranges once a year.
Right.
So, and in my case, the last part of that third question, I didn't feel very cultural differences. There were mentality differences. There were
Yeah.
sort of my mentality was different, but on a personal and a cultural level, I felt comfortable. I went to the Russian theater. I enjoyed things, but I was raised in the West, so some of these typical Soviet era performers were not my cup of tea, and I didn't go to things like that. But the classics and ballet and that sort of stuff, we both benefited, my wife and I. So I think, just to summarize, that I believe, and maybe I'm wrong, but I got the sense that Russians reacted differently to me than my colleagues,
Uh-huh.
than
Uh-huh.
my Western peers. And I
Yeah.
wasn't the only one. We had a strong network of people who could also speak Russian well, and some who were Slavic, some who were not. I really marveled at the people who were not had nothing to do with Slavic languages who could speak Russian better than I could, and there were a few of those. And so some of them were probably spies, but I was too stupid to realize that. Right.
Right. But it was a unique period in what you're just describing, that ability to interact of Russians and foreigners. I mean, to interact on a personal level, to get to know each other. It's unique. I don't think that there's ever been any similar period in Russian history in which there was that wide scale interaction. I mean, Peter the Great imported craftspeople and experts and so on. So, and I haven't really looked at the numbers to compare it, but that sort of opening to the West that he represented was repeated in this period, but it's a unique period in that those personal relationships.
I just wanted to say that my feeling of acceptance um, was almost immediate back in
Uh-huh.
1982. And so that uh, I don't remember anybody at that time that I worked with, amongst other diplomats or business people, that felt that way, or that was
Okay.
received. So for me, the cultural groundings, I guess religious, no religious, were not that I'm a religious person, but the traditions are very similar. So
Right.
that's why I was always ready to go back. Okay.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
had a different experience. Like I had colleagues who worked in the Canadian Embassy at the same time. They would never go back
Right.
because
Right.
they sat in their office and they wrote reports based on translated articles that they got from. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's different. I felt even then part of society.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, you asked earlier about Russia ended up rejecting the U.S. model, um, and I think what they rejected was more of an Anglo-Saxon model as opposed to simply, I mean, I know you're focused on US colleagues and
No,
friends.
I want to be broader than that. So
Yeah.
please,
I
whatever.
think I
Yeah.
would think the Anglo-Saxon capitalist model, um, they like the capitalist, they like the exploitation part of being a capitalist. And there's not a lot of people, Abramovich being an exception, and a few others that actually used their ill-gotten gains for the benefit of the Russian people. But most of them took their money to Switzerland and you bought big yachts, and the hell with, let them eat cake, I think. So
Right.
in that respect, they don't even have an affinity for their religion. as
Mhm.
Putin claims to have. You know,
Yeah.
it's so fake that it just makes me ill. I'm not a religious person. I'm an agnostic, but
Right.
the point is, I think um, they rejected. Um, well, it wasn't the entire population. I think the people who mattered. I think I would rephrase it: people who mattered, who made change or could influence change, rejected it, including people who benefited from the capitalist. The, okay, so
Yeah.
they did
Yeah.
nothing to spread the good news or spread the wealth, and that's on their shoulders. That's not
Mhm.
on the capitalist model from Anglo-Saxon origins. That's what I really believe that because, um, but again, there's two sides of the story. They didn't have any emotional ways to temper their views. Okay,
Mhm.
they didn't really have any tradition. Even the Orthodox Church isn't in any Orthodox country isn't very good at taking care of poor, destitute people, despite what the Bible says. And so
Uh-huh.
to expect the Russians, um, especially the ones who got rich very quickly, very easily, to somehow discover this humanistic part of themselves. I think nobody should have expected that.
Yeah. 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 Well, then there we have it. There we have it.
When
Yeah.
was the last time you were there?
2017.
Oh,
2017.
me too.
I went there. I have a friend. I had friends who've since left from Yaroslavl, and they had a friendship society, and they had a 20th anniversary, I believe, or something like that, of this friendship society. So I went for that. So it wasn't a business purpose, and it was mostly to see people I knew
Yeah.
because yeah, at that point. But
I, I,
yeah,
left, I
and
left a lot of friends there. I'm in
yeah,
touch with many of them,
yeah,
but they find a way to survive. Many of the people that I had employed or have left or spend as much time outside of Russia
yeah,
as we can, which is sad because they're human capital that could help
absolutely,
the country.
absolutely, 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 absolutely,
So yeah,
absolutely.
I'm resigned to the fact that in my lifetime I probably won't go back there.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
uh, because they don't want me back, and B, I would be too depressed by what I see.
yeah, yeah,
Given the effort that all of us put in to doing what we were doing, yes, we wanted to make money for ourselves. Yes, we wanted success, but I think all of us, well, most of the people, expats that I know and dealt with over the years, really thought they were doing good,
uh-huh, uh-huh.
and it's
Yeah.
a shame.
Well, so it's these memories of that time that we're trying to preserve. I don't know what use they will be, but none of us expected anything that we encountered in our lifetime anyway.
Sure.
And so hopefully others will benefit from this. Yeah,
Yeah, I congratulate you for taking this on.
yeah.
Um, I'm sure you've heard many similar stories and have
Well,
emotional
everyone is
attachment.
somewhat different, and I think taking all the stories together gives a whole different approach. I mean, what students and people, analysts talk about are the decisions made on a very high level and what politics allows. And what it allowed was done by people like yourself and others that are more, it's not exactly from the bottom up, but if you know what I mean, it
Yes.
was real people who implemented or took advantage of whatever those opportunities were that,
Yeah.
is not really the way history is portrayed in a sense of
Yeah.
the people who do it. And so that's sort of the philosophy of history that's embedded in this. So the more these stories to me reinforce that notion of how history was made in that period by a lot of people thinking similarly and acting upon those beliefs. So that's
Yeah.
really what we have in mind.
Well, look, I'd like to thank you for reaching out to me because as you can tell, I'm enthusiastic about a lot of these things, and I was poured my heart and soul into all the things that I
Absolutely.
did there. And I just feel for the Russian people and for my friends that they don't deserve. They haven't they haven't deserved any of the revolution
No, no,
or the massacres in the Second World War. I
right.
was my abiding memory is the first time I went to the Leningrad cemetery, and
Oh, yeah,
it
yes,
was just
yes.
I'm not very sentimental, but I like everybody else or many people I was with there, bawling my eyes out, knowing that more than 1 million people perished uh, and are buried there anyway.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. Well,
thank
good.
you, thank
Thank
you for the
you.
opportunity,
Thank
and
you.